The grand hall gleamed under the brilliance of crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting off towering glass walls that overlooked the heart of Washington, D.C. But this was no ordinary business gathering. This was the Global Economic and Technology Summit, where the world's sharpest business minds, the most powerful CEOs, and the strategists shaping the future of the world had convened. This event wasn't just about discussing market trends, it was a battlefield. A stage where bold ideologies clashed, where decisions were made that could rewrite the course of the global economy. Here, money wasn't the main topic. It was about power, vision, and who had the audacity to control the game. And amidst a sea of seasoned faces, Barron Trump entered. Young but composed, clad in a perfectly tailored suit, every step he took carried a quiet confidence. He wasn't the centerpiece of this event, nor the most influential figure in the room, but the moment he walked in, curious eyes immediately turned toward him. As the son of a former president and heir to one of the world's largest business empires, Barron Trump was an enigma. People speculated about him. Was he a true intellectual force, or merely a name living in the shadow of his family legacy? Today, that answer would start to unfold. On the other side of the hall, another man commanded attention. Oliver Grant, a seasoned businessman at 55, his salt and pepper hair was as sharp as his piercing gaze. Standing among a circle of high-profile CEOs, he effortlessly dominated the conversation. As the chairman of Grant Dynamics, a conglomerate that ruled the artificial intelligence and big data industries, Grant didn't just control billions of dollars, he controlled the very digital future of the world. But what made him truly formidable wasn't just his immense wealth. It was his ruthless business philosophy. For years, Grant had championed the belief that money, data, and strategy were the only three pillars of success. Ethics, trust, mere illusions, distractions that only held back those strong enough to conquer the heights of power. He had appeared on countless televised debates, unapologetically declaring, "Trust is nothing but a crutch people use to fool themselves. In the world of business, the strong survive and the weak get crushed. That is the only rule." And in his eyes, Barron Trump was nothing more than a privileged boy born into luxury, someone who had never truly tasted failure. Then came the golden opportunity. The moderator announced the start of the open floor discussion. Grant's lips curled into a smirk, his sharp eyes locking onto Barron. This is it, he thought. Amidst the grandeur of the hall, Grant leaned forward slightly, his voice smooth, yet unmistakably challenging. "I have a question for Barron Trump." The room fell into immediate silence. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Barron. Grant took his time, his words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of a direct challenge. "Do you truly believe that a business can achieve great success without putting profit above all else?" A simple question, yet one loaded with meaning. This wasn't just about business strategy. This was a direct attack on Barron's core beliefs, on his definition of success, and on his very presence in this room. A moment passed. Barron Trump rose to his feet. His gaze swept across the room, locking onto the expectant stares of CEOs, investors, and strategists, some of the most powerful minds in the world. No one could predict what would happen next. Would he falter? Would he deliver a response so sharp it would silence the entire room? The hall was utterly still. Oliver Grant's question might have seemed simple, but no one in this room was naive enough to believe it was innocent curiosity. Grant wasn't looking for an answer. He had laid a trap, a calculated move designed to dismantle Barron Trump in front of the world's most influential financial minds. Slowly, Barron Trump took a deep breath. He lifted his head, his expression unwavering. That made Grant's smirk fade. Barron Trump let his gaze sweep across the room. The grand hall fell into absolute silence. Barron Trump wasn't just responding to Oliver Grant. He was addressing every single person in that room. And when Barron finally spoke, It was as if the entire space had been drained of sound. Everyone was waiting. No one knew how Barron would react. Oliver Grant's question was more than just an intellectual challenge. It was a declaration of war, a direct confrontation initiated by a seasoned businessman who had gone head-to-head with some of the sharpest minds in the industry. And now he was watching closely, waiting to see how his young, untested opponent would respond. But Barron didn't rush his answer. He stood there, his gaze sweeping across the room as if carefully evaluating each face. Powerful CEOs, veteran investors, industry titans who had spent their entire lives chasing profit. None of them expected a young man in his 20s to deliver a response so compelling that it would force Grant to reconsider his own argument. And then, when Barron finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that commanded attention. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady, composed, and unshaken. "Mr. Grant," Barron began, his voice calm yet razor-sharp. "Before I answer your question, I'd like to ask you one of my own." Grant raised an eyebrow, the corner of his lips curling into a challenging smirk. "I like your confidence," he said, crossing his arms. "Go ahead." Barron gave a slight nod before shifting his attention to the entire hall. "We are gathered here in a room filled with individuals who have built and led some of the most successful companies in the world, and I think we can all agree that profit is important. But tell me this, Mr. Grant, have the greatest companies in history always been the ones that prioritized profit above all else?" Grant let out a soft chuckle, as if Barron had walked right into the trap he had set. "Of course," he responded instantly. "Without profit, a company dies. That's an undeniable fact." Barron gave a small nod, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in his eyes. "Then let's take a look at companies like SpaceX, Apple, Amazon, the giants that have reshaped the world. If they had only focused on short-term profits, would they have invested billions into technologies that were once deemed impossible? Would they have taken the risks that no one else dared to take? And most importantly, would they have reached the level of success they have today?" A hush fell over the room. A few heads nodded in agreement. Barron wasn't outright rejecting Grant's argument. Instead, he had strategically reframed the debate, forcing his opponent to reevaluate his own stance. Grant narrowed his eyes slightly. He hadn't expected such a precise counterattack, but he wasn't the kind of man to concede easily. "You have a point," Grant admitted, though his voice remained firm. "Those companies succeeded because of their groundbreaking products, not because they built their businesses on ethics or trust. The market doesn't reward weakness." Barron didn't flinch. He met Grant's gaze head-on and responded without hesitation. "Do you believe that a company can achieve massive success without the trust of its customers, employees, and partners?" Grant opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. Barron pressed forward, his voice unwavering. "Money matters, yes, but trust is what creates money. A company can generate billions in revenue, but if it loses the trust of its customers, if it betrays the loyalty of its employees, it will eventually collapse." The room fell into an even deeper silence. People were no longer just observing the debate. They were questioning their own perspectives. Grant stared at Barron. For the first time in this discussion, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. This kid was far more formidable than he had anticipated. But Grant wasn't the type to back down. He knew that if he couldn't outmaneuver Barron with logic alone, he needed to inject emotion into the equation. Taking a slow breath, Grant's lips curved into a smile, but not a friendly one. "All right, Barron," he said, his tone sharp and deliberate. "You talk about trust, ethics, and noble ideals, but let's talk about reality. Do you think struggling families out there, people working 2 jobs just to put food on the table, care about a CEO's moral compass? Or do they care about whether they can afford dinner tomorrow night?" A direct attack. A question designed to corner Barron, to force him to confront the harshest realities of the world. The room held its breath. This was no longer just a debate about business principles. This was a battle of world views. And everyone was waiting to see how would Barron respond to this next blow. The tension in the hall was razor sharp, but Barron Trump stood firm, unwavering. He knew this was the moment to deliver a response that could shift the entire course of the debate. They didn't see their employees as numbers on a spreadsheet. They saw them as individuals who mattered. A low murmur rippled through the audience. Barron wasn't just countering Oliver Grant, he was elevating the entire discussion to a higher level. His voice grew sharper, more resolute. Mr. Grant, you're right. Millions of people out there are working 2 jobs just to survive. But have you ever stopped to ask, who put them in that position? For the first time, Grant's expression flickered. He didn't respond immediately. Barron pressed on, his gaze cold and unwavering. It's the corporations that prioritize profit above all else, neglecting their social responsibility, that have led them here. The companies that treat employees as disposable, slashing wages while spending millions on marketing campaigns to paint themselves as community champions. The room stirred. Some exchanged glances, others nodded subtly. At that moment, Barron wasn't just debating Grant anymore. He was exposing a truth everyone knew, but no one dared to say out loud. For the first time, Grant didn't have an immediate rebuttal. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because Barron had struck a nerve that even he couldn't deny. Barron didn't stop. Mr. Grant, leaders like you, those who focus solely on numbers and bottom lines, often say that ethics don't pay salaries. But let me ask you this, do employees want to be part of a company that treats them as expendable, or one that sees them as an essential part of something greater? His gaze swept across the hall, locking onto one person after another. We all understand that profit matters, but if a company chases profit while ignoring ethics, it will inevitably collapse. Because when hard times come, employees will leave, customers will lose faith, and no amount of money will ever be enough to buy back trust. Silence fell, not an awkward silence, but a silence of realization. For the first time in this debate, Oliver Grant didn't respond right away. He was thinking. And not just him. Every person in the room was no longer seeing Barron as a young man defending his perspective. They were beginning to see him as someone who could reshape the way they thought about business itself. Then, from the back of the room, a voice cut through the stillness. Then tell us, Barron, what should a company do during a financial crisis? When standing at the edge of bankruptcy, can you really uphold ethics? The question came from an older businessman, one who had seen empires rise and fall. Barron turned, meeting the man's gaze. He didn't waver. A quiet, knowing smile formed on his lips. The smile of a man who was ready for the next challenge. The tension in the room was now unbearable. All eyes were locked onto Oliver Grant. For the first time in this debate, he had no immediate comeback. Barron Trump had just asked a question that wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. If power truly lies in controlling information, then why have the most powerful companies in history collapsed simply because they lost public trust? Grant narrowed his eyes. He refused to acknowledge that he had been cornered, but as a seasoned businessman, he knew one thing: losing was not an option. Grant leaned back, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room, as if trying to regain his footing. "Not bad, Barron," he finally said, his voice no longer dripping with condescension, but carrying a measured weight. "You argue that trust determines the fate of a business. I won't deny that, but there's one crucial thing you're overlooking. Trust can be manipulated." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged contemplative glances. Grant had found an opening. His voice sharpened, each word cutting like a blade. "Look at companies like Blockbuster or Nokia," he continued. "They didn't fail because they lost customer trust. They failed because they couldn't adapt. But take the most dominant tech empires today, Amazon, Google, Meta. They don't just rely on trust, they control it. They don't wait for customers to trust them, they dictate what customers should trust. Grant locked eyes with Barron, his gaze piercing, as if peeling back every layer of his argument. You talk about real power, Barron, but ask yourself, power doesn't come from earning a customer's trust. It comes from controlling what the customer believes they trust. The room fell into an eerie silence. Grant had just played a masterstroke. His argument forced many in the room to reconsider how the business world truly functioned. He clenched his fists slightly, pressing his attack further. "If you believe power lies in trust," he said, his voice steady yet razor-sharp, "then answer me this. Can a company manufacture trust to maintain its power? And if so, is that trust really as objective as you claim it to be?" A strategic question, not just to challenge Barron's argument, but to redefine the very nature of trust itself. The room was dead silent. Would Barron be cornered? Or would he find a way to strike back? Everyone was waiting. But Barron Trump didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on Grant, unwavering. His voice, when it came, was calm, but carried the weight of conviction. "Mr. Grant," Barron began, his tone composed yet commanding, "I won't deny that some companies have manipulated trust to maintain power, but that doesn't make them invincible. History has proven that every deception has a breaking point, and when fabricated trust is exposed, that power collapses faster than anything else." Grant raised an eyebrow. Barron continued, his eyes sweeping the room, each word embedding itself into the silence. "You claim that power lies in the ability to control customer perception, but let me ask you this. Has any company truly lasted for generations purely through manipulation? Or in the end, is it only those who build genuine trust that stand the test of time?" This time, Grant didn't reply immediately. Barron took a step forward, his voice sharper, each syllable cutting through the air like a well-aimed strike. "So the real question isn't can trust be manipulated, but rather, can a business survive in the long run if it relies solely on manipulation, without any real value?" Grant remained silent. The room held its breath, and in that moment, everyone realized Barron Trump wasn't just debating. He was reshaping the way they understood power and success in business. Oliver Grant took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the entire room could see it. He was no longer as composed as before. He parted his lips as if about to say something, but stopped. For the first time in his career, he couldn't find a convincing response. Not a single word was spoken. The room fell into absolute silence. Jonathan Reeves, who had once dominated the debate, was now silent. The murmurs in the audience gradually faded as every eye turned once again to Barron Trump. But Barron didn't rush to seize the moment. He didn't press Grant into a corner. He didn't revel in an early victory. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath, his gaze sweeping across the entire room before he spoke. His voice steady, powerful, carrying the weight of someone who understood every word he was about to say. "Mr. Grant," Barron began, his tone composed but sharp, "I don't deny that power, strategy, and profit play crucial roles in business. But if those were all that mattered, then the greatest empires in history would have never collapsed." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "There is one thing that I believe we can all agree on. Whether you are a seasoned CEO or a young entrepreneur, no company can exist without customers. No empire can stand without the trust of those who support it." A few subtle nods rippled through the audience. Barron knew he had touched on something universal, a truth that most understood but rarely acknowledged outright. Grant narrowed his eyes but remained silent. Barron continued, this time locking eyes with Grant, delivering what felt like a final declaration. "The business world is not merely a battlefield where the strong crush the weak. It is an ecosystem, one where the most successful companies are not the most ruthless, but the ones that balance profit with responsibility, the ones that create real value, Not just for shareholders, but for the people who work for them, buy from them, and believe in them. The room fell into complete silence. And then Barron delivered the final blow. "So the real question isn't who can control the market best," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "It's who can earn the market's trust and keep it." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Grant's. "And in that race, Mr. Grant, those who chase only power and control are always the ones who lose in the end." A long pause followed. Then, like a wave crashing against the shore, the room erupted into applause. Some even rose to their feet. Those who had once chuckled at Barron now exchanged thoughtful glances. Barron Trump hadn't just won the debate. He had reshaped the way people in that room thought about business itself. Oliver Grant remained in his seat, his expression dark, his jaw tight. But he said nothing more. Because deep down he knew no amount of arguing could undo a fundamental truth. A battle had ended, but a revolution in business thinking might have just begun. The applause still echoed across the grand hall. Yet Barron Trump wasn't finished. He could have stopped right then. He had already won. But Barron wasn't the type to settle for a partial victory. This moment wasn't just about defeating Oliver Grant. It was about delivering a message powerful enough to change the way every person in that room viewed business leadership and true responsibility. He took a slow breath, allowing the noise to settle before he continued. No need to raise his voice. No need for dramatic gestures. Just the calm certainty in his eyes and the weight of each word. "The world," Barron began, "is constantly changing, constantly evolving. What is considered an unshakable truth today might become tomorrow's greatest lesson. The empires that once seemed untouchable have crumbled. The dominant ideologies of yesterday have been replaced. But there is one thing that has never changed." He paused. His gaze swept across the audience, making sure each person felt the gravity of his next words. Human nature, silence. Not a single person dared to break it. We can talk about strategy, about profit, about power, but in the end, it all comes back to people. A company can have the most advanced technology, the largest capital, the strongest control over the market, but if it loses the trust of its customers, its employees, the very people who built it, then all of it becomes meaningless. Some heads in the audience nodded. A few eyes that once held skepticism now carried reflection. Barron pressed on, his voice steadier than ever. "Mr. Grant, you say that power and control determine who survives and who gets left behind. But let me ask you one final question." He paused, ensuring Grant was fully locked in. "If power is everything, then why do the most powerful people in history always fear losing it?" The air in the room tightened. Grant narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Barron continued, "Because power without trust and support is nothing but a sandcastle before the tide." He took one deliberate step back, his eyes still fixed on Grant. "You may continue believing that controlling the market is the only way to win. But I believe that in the long run, the real winners are not those who control, but those who are chosen." A stunning silence followed. Then suddenly, a wave of applause, louder than before, erupted across the room. This time, it wasn't just polite clapping. This was a movement. Business leaders, investors, people who had sided with Grant at the start were now looking at Barron with an entirely different gaze. Not just because he had won the debate, but because he had spoken a truth that everyone knew, yet no one dared to say out loud. Oliver Grant remained motionless. He didn't argue. He couldn't. For the first time in his career, he had been defeated. Not by an industry veteran, not by a corporate rival, but by a young man. One who had grasped something that many in the business world never understood. True power doesn't come from control. It comes from trust. The debate was over. But its impact would be felt for a long, long time. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love for you to share its message by liking and sharing it with your friends, helping us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to us and allows us to create more meaningful stories for you. Don't forget to share your thoughts about the story and let us know which city you're watching from. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in our next story.